almost everything you think a famous person said, they never actually said. Not even close. And I do not mean a small paraphrase here or a slightly different wording there. I mean the quote was born somewhere completely different, lived its whole life under a stranger's roof, and then one day someone slapped a famous face on it, and the whole world just nodded and moved on. No questions asked, no sources checked, nothing. Just a good-looking sentence wearing someone else's name tag, walking through history like it owns the place. I got genuinely obsessed with this. A while back I started pulling on one thread, just one quote I had seen shared about 1,000 times, with a name attached that felt almost too perfect. And what I found underneath that thread was not just one mistake. It was a whole system, a machine, a quiet little factory that runs on human laziness, emotional convenience, and the very specific desire to feel like you are quoting someone smarter than yourself. So I went deep. I spent a long time going through sources, tracking origins, following citations that turned into dead ends, and finding the actual stories behind the lines everyone repeats as gospel. What came out of that process is this list: 33 of the most famous, most repeated, most confidently shared quotes in circulation. Each one pinned to the wrong person for the wrong reasons, in ways that are sometimes funny, sometimes uncomfortable, and occasionally so perfectly ironic they make your head spin. This is not a lecture. I am not standing here with a red pen correcting your homework. I am telling you what I found, the same way I would tell a friend, because honestly, some of this stuff made me laugh out loud, and some of it made me genuinely uneasy about how we decide what is true. Because here is the thing that kept hitting me as I went through all 33 of these. Every single fake quote reveals something, not about the person it was pinned on, but about us. About what we needed to believe in that moment, what kind of wisdom we were hungry for, what kind of authority we were willing to invent to get it. The fake quote is not just a mistake, it is a mirror. And the reflection is a little uncomfortable if you look long enough. We are going to start with one of the most shared quotes in the history of the internet. And I want you to think about where you think it comes from before I tell you, because I guarantee the real answer is going to feel slightly absurd once you hear it. If this kind of deep dig into the lies history swallowed whole sounds like something you want more of, subscribe and hit like right now. It genuinely helps more than you know. And there are 32 more entries in this list that get progressively wilder from here. The first entry on this list is a line about enemies. Specifically, it is a piece of advice suggesting you should keep the people who want to ruin you even closer than the people who love you. You have heard it. You have probably seen it attributed to an ancient military strategist, maybe shared under a dramatic photograph of fog over mountains, or printed on the kind of poster that hangs in the office of someone who has read exactly one book about strategy and wants you to know about it. The ancient writer it gets credited to was absolutely a real figure, and absolutely a serious thinker. His actual work is precise, layered, and built around real strategic principles that military theorists still study. He wrote about deception, about knowing your opponent's weaknesses, about the relationship between stillness and movement in conflict. It is genuinely sharp material, and it makes complete sense that people want to attach dramatic wisdom to his name. But that specific line about keeping enemies close, that is not from an ancient military text. That line was written for a film, a crime film, a story about a powerful family, organized betrayal, and the kind of loyalty that costs people everything. The character who delivers it is not a general or a philosopher. He is a fictional crime boss, making a calculated speech about power and survival, and the whole scene smells of expensive suits, cigarette smoke, and the particular tension of a room where everyone is pretending to trust each other. The line fits the ancient strategist so perfectly that people never stop to ask the most basic question. When was this first written down, and where? Because if you go looking, the ancient source does not exist. There is no manuscript, no chapter, no fragment. There is only the film, the fictional character, and a cultural shortcut that decided fitting someone's reputation was close enough to actually being their words. And that right there is the engine behind almost everything else on this list. The costume fits well enough. Nobody checks the label. The fake quote walks into history, finds a comfortable chair, and stays for generations. The next one on this list is darker than the first, because it is not just a misattribution. It is something closer to a historical setup. A woman got handed a sentence she never wrote, in a language that was not even framed as hers originally, and then got charged for it in the court of public memory for generations. And the worst part is that by the time anyone seriously questioned it, the damage was so deep it had basically become architecture. The quote, you know. It is about the poor having no bread, and someone suggesting they eat something rich and expensive instead. It became the defining image of royal cruelty, a perfect crystallization of power so disconnected from reality it could not even conceive of hunger as a real experience. People repeat it like a fact. Teachers have used it in classrooms. It shows up in documentaries with dramatic music underneath it. It has its own cultural weight, its own gravitational pull. But here is what I found when I actually traced it. The line existed in written form before the woman it got pinned on was even a child. A philosopher used a version of it in a manuscript written well before her name meant anything to anyone. He was not describing her. He was not describing anyone specific. He was using it as a generic illustration of how people insulated by wealth think about poverty, a rhetorical device, not a reported quote from a real conversation. The original was not even about cake in the way people imagine it. It was about a different kind of rich bread, the kind that wealthy households had in surplus while common people went without. The image of a frosted birthday cake came later, added by a culture that wanted the scene to feel even more absurdly out of touch. So what happened is this. A pre-existing rhetorical example floated around for years, detached from any specific person. Then, a revolution needed a face for everything it was fighting against. It needed a symbol of excess and blindness and foreign indifference. And there was a woman who was glamorous, foreign-born, associated with silk and spending, and already deeply unpopular. The quote fit her like a glove, not because she said it, but because she was exactly the kind of person the story needed to have said it. That is a different kind of fake quote. It is not an accident. It is not lazy journalism. It is a quote that was selected and assigned the way you cast an actor for a role. She fit the part. She got the line. And she carried it into history without ever having opened her mouth to say it. What unsettles me most about this one is the structure of it, because once you see that structure, you start seeing it everywhere on this list. A sentence exists. A famous name is nearby, The sentence fits the name well enough that no one stops to ask who actually put pen to paper. And just like that, a rumor calcifies into record. Now, the third entry does something slightly different, and honestly, it might be the one that bothers me most personally, because this one hits close to home for anyone who has ever shared something online thinking they were spreading a little wisdom. There is a quote about doing the same thing repeatedly and expecting a different result each time. You know it. It is probably the most reposted definition of a specific word in the English language. It is compact, a little cutting, and it makes you feel smart for recognizing yourself or someone else in it. And it has been sitting under the name of one of the most recognized scientific minds in history for so long that questioning it feels almost disrespectful. But when I went looking for the original source, I found nothing. Not a letter, not a recorded speech, not a margin note from a colleague. Nothing that connects that line to the physicist whose face gets attached to it. What I did find was a trail leading through self-improvement literature, recovery communities, and motivational publishing. Places that were producing exactly this kind of compact, punchy, slightly judgmental wisdom, and needed a credible voice to carry it. And that is the key word: credible. The quote does not need the physicist's name to be true or useful. It stands fine on its own. But with his name attached, it stops being advice and becomes a verdict delivered from the top of the intellectual mountain. It gets the glow of a Nobel-adjacent stamp of approval. Suddenly, it is not just a good idea. It is practically a law of the universe, confirmed by the smartest person available. That is what the name does. It is not decoration. It is authority, borrowed without permission from a dead man who had enough real ideas of his own and genuinely did not need to moonlight as a motivational calendar. The quote found a famous face the way a parasite finds a host: quietly, efficiently, and with remarkable staying power. And the next entry on this list shows exactly how that same mechanism works when it is not an accident at all, but a deliberate choice made by people in a boardroom. A corporation once looked at one of history's greatest creative minds, took his name, his reputation, and the entire weight of his legacy, and used it to sell computers. And the quote they attached to his name was not his, not even slightly. And nobody stopped them, because the costume fit so well that questioning it felt almost rude. Here is how it happened. There is a line about simplicity being the highest form of sophistication. It is clean, it is elegant, and it sounds exactly like something a Renaissance polymath would scribble in a notebook between designing an impossible flying machine and sketching human anatomy with unsettling precision. The sentence has that quality of old wisdom, the kind that feels like it was carved slowly out of something heavy and permanent, which is precisely why a marketing team in a glass office somewhere decided it was perfect for their campaign. The polymath was real. His obsession with proportion, with clarity, with stripping away everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. That was real too. He filled notebooks with ideas that were centuries ahead of their time. He cared about the relationship between beauty and function in a way that genuinely does feel modern, which is exactly the trap. Because caring about something and saying a specific sentence about it are completely different things. I care about a lot of things I have never put into words in a particular way. That does not mean anyone gets to write the words for me and sign my name underneath. There is no notebook page. There is no letter. There is no contemporary account of him saying anything close to that sentence. What there is a company that understood something powerful. That if you dress a sales pitch in historical clothing and give it a famous enough name, people do not just buy the product. They buy the feeling of being connected to greatness. The quote became the cologne the advertisement wore to seem ancient and wise. And it worked. It worked so thoroughly that even now, decades later, people repeat that line as genuine Renaissance wisdom without any idea it came from a room full of people trying to move units. What strikes me about this one is how clean the crime is. No one forged a document. No one made a dramatic false claim. They just placed a sentence next to a name and let human psychology do the rest. We are wired to connect proximity with ownership. The name was there. The quote was there. The rest assembled itself automatically in millions of minds simultaneously. And that brings me straight into the next entry, because this one operates on almost the exact same principle, but with a twist that I find genuinely maddening. Because this time the person who got erased was not a historical figure from centuries ago. She was alive. She watched it happen. A line about how history tends to remember women who broke the rules while the quiet ones disappear from the record entirely. You have seen it. It has been on tote bags, framed prints, social media graphics, the kind of merchandise that sits in the intersection of inspiration and decoration. It is a genuinely good observation, sharp, true, and built from real intellectual work. The problem is that the name attached to it in popular culture belongs to a glamorous entertainment figure who never wrote anything of the kind. The actual author was a working academic, a historian, someone who spent her career in the specific, unglamorous business of reading archives, tracking sources, and writing sentences that were meant to illuminate something true about the past. She wrote that line in a serious, scholarly context. It was not a rallying cry. It was not designed to go on a mug. It was an observation embedded in real intellectual argument, the kind of sentence that earns its weight by what surrounds it, not by standing alone in large font over a dramatic photograph. Then it escaped. That is the only word for it. The line left its context the way a dog leaves a yard when someone forgets to close the gate. It got picked up, passed around, stripped of its surroundings, and repackaged as a general-purpose feminist slogan. And at some point in that journey, pop culture looked at it and made a decision that is so revealing it almost hurts. It found the most visually iconic, most photographed, most culturally recognizable woman it could think of, and handed her the microphone. Not because there was any connection, not because of any evidence, but because a powerful sentence needs a powerful face, and the actual author was not famous enough to carry the aesthetic weight the quote had accumulated by that point. So a historian's insight got dressed up in someone else's image and sent back out into the world wearing the wrong name, like a coat that does not quite fit, but looks good enough from a distance. The woman who actually wrote it did not disappear. But she had to spend years of her life clarifying something that should never have needed clarification. That her words were her words. Which is the kind of sentence that should not need to be said out loud, and yet here we are. And the next entry on this list takes this same dynamic and cranks it into something even more deliberate, even more constructed, because the next one was not an accident at all. Someone sat down, opened a blank page, and deliberately wrote a lie about one of history's most important figures. Not out of malice exactly, out of something almost more unsettling than malice. Out of the calm, professional belief that the truth was simply not good enough for the job that needed doing. This entry is about a biographer, a man who was hired essentially to build a reputation. His subject was a major historical figure, a military leader and statesman whose actual life was complicated, politically messy, and thoroughly human in all the ways that make for honest biography, but terrible national mythology. The biographer looked at the real material and made a decision. He decided that what the public needed was not a man. They needed an icon. And icons require origin stories, clean and simple and morally legible. The kind of story a child can hold in both hands without dropping anything. So he invented one. He wrote a scene involving the leader as a young boy. A moment of accidental destruction followed by immediate, voluntary confession. The boy in the story does not hesitate, does not calculate, does not weigh options the way real children do when they have broken something and are standing in the particular cold sweat of anticipated consequences. He simply tells the truth, immediately, with the kind of effortless virtue that exists primarily in fables and product packaging. The scene was designed to do one specific thing, to attach honesty to this figure so deeply, so early, and so visually that no future complexity could fully dislodge it. It was a branding exercise dressed in period clothing, and it worked with a thoroughness that the biographer himself probably could not have predicted. The story spread, it entered school books, it became the kind of thing teachers repeated with complete confidence because they had heard it from teachers who had heard it from teachers, all the way back to a man sitting alone at a desk, making something up and calling it a life story. What bothers me about this one is the deliberateness of it. Every other entry on this list so far has involved some degree of accident, some drift of a sentence away from its origin, some gradual detachment of words from their source. But this one was constructed. Someone built a false memory for an entire nation and handed it to them at childhood, when the architecture of belief is still wet and takes any shape you press into it. The figure at the center of the story was real. His actual record was substantial enough that he did not need a borrowed legend to be significant. But the biographer understood something that feels uncomfortably modern. People do not just want to admire leaders. They want to trust them. And trust is easier to manufacture in miniature, in small domestic scenes, in a child and a moment of simple moral courage, than it is to earn through the accumulated weight of a real and complicated life. And if one man with a pen could do that to a founding figure, imagine what an entire film industry could do to a medieval warrior with nothing but a camera, a script, and a very large budget for slow motion. That is exactly what the next entry is about, a real historical fighter, someone who genuinely led resistance against a much larger and more powerful force, who was captured, tried, and executed in circumstances that were brutal and politically motivated. The actual story of this person does not lack for drama. It does not need embellishment. The bare facts carry enough weight to fill any serious account. But a film decided the bare facts were not quite enough, not cinematic enough, not built for the moment when the music swells and the audience needs something to grab onto. something to carry out of the theater in their chest like a small, warm coal. So the screenwriters gave this figure a speech, not a paraphrase of anything documented, not a dramatic compression of real words, a completely original piece of writing, crafted by people living centuries after the events, designed from the ground up to produce a specific physical reaction in a seated audience. And it worked. It worked so completely that the speech entered popular memory as if it had been carved into stone at the time. People who could not tell you a single verified fact about this person's actual military campaigns or the political context of their execution could recite lines from that speech with the confidence of someone quoting scripture. The film did not just tell a story about a historical figure. It replaced the historical figure with a performance. And the performance was so compelling, so physically felt in the body when you heard it, that reality simply could not compete. The wars were real. The resistance was real. The courage required to do what this person did was absolutely real. But the words that now define them in popular imagination were written in a modern office by people who understood one thing above all else: that a single, unforgettable sentence, delivered at the right pitch and the right volume, can outlast any historical record. And what comes next on this list shows that you do not even need a film to pull that off. One of the most repeated pieces of wisdom in the last 100 years was taken from a real human being, run through a cultural blender, and served back to the world as a single, smooth sentence that the original thinker would barely recognize as connected to anything he actually argued. This one stings a little differently than the previous entries. The biographer who invented a moral legend did it deliberately. The screenwriters who wrote a rebel's famous speech knew exactly what they were doing. But this entry is about something quieter and in some ways more damaging. It is about what happens when a genuinely complex set of ideas meets a culture with a very short attention span and a deep hunger for simple answers. The thinker at the center of this entry spent his life building a detailed, demanding argument about the relationship between personal conduct and political change. His actual position was not a bumper sticker. It was a framework. It involved discipline, sacrifice, spiritual commitment, and a specific understanding of how individual behavior connects to collective transformation over long periods of time. It was not easy material. It was not designed to fit on a small square of card next to a scented candle. But then someone distilled it, took the whole living, breathing architecture of the argument and pressed it down into one sentence about being the change you want to see. And the sentence is not wrong exactly. It points in the right general direction, the way a rough sketch points toward a building. But the sketch is not the building. And handing people the sketch while telling them it is the full design is a quiet form of deception, even when nobody means it that way. What happened next is what always happens. The sentence got repeated, then repeated again, then printed and shared and stitched onto things and used to end speeches. And with every repetition, it drifted further from the original argument, until the original argument became almost irrelevant. The thinker became a logo, his entire life's work compressed into 11 words that feel wise, but ask almost nothing of the person reading them. The real ideas behind that sentence asked a great deal. They were uncomfortable and specific, and tied to real consequences in the real world. The polished version asks you to reflect briefly and perhaps make slightly better personal choices, which is pleasant but is not remotely the same thing. One is a philosophy built for changing the world. The other is advice for changing your morning routine. They wear the same face, but they live in completely different rooms. And I keep coming back to this one because it represents something I think is genuinely worth sitting with. The fake quote machine does not always work through invention or theft. Sometimes it works through compression, through the slow removal of everything hard and specific until what remains is smooth enough to share without friction. That process does not feel like dishonesty while it is happening. It feels like communication. It feels like making something accessible. But somewhere in that process, the truth gets shaved down until the shape is wrong, and nobody notices because the surface is so polished. Now, the next entry takes a completely different angle on all of this, because this one is not about compression or invention or theft from a living tradition. This one is about the moment when art became so powerful that it simply walked into history and sat down in the chair that facts had been occupying. And facts did not even put up a fight. There is a dying declaration that has been quoted in courtrooms, classrooms, films, novels, and countless conversations about betrayal. It is among the most dramatically perfect sentences ever attached to a historical moment. It lands like a door closing in an empty house, cold, final, and impossible to mishear. People know exactly which moment it belongs to, and exactly who said it. Except the historical record does not know those things at all. Ancient accounts of that moment disagree with each other in ways that are more than minor. Some suggest the man said something, possibly in a different language than the famous version implies, something that carries a very different emotional texture, closer to confusion or grief than to the clean, wounded dignity of the famous line. Some suggest he said nothing that anyone recorded with any confidence. A violent political act in a crowded space, and the only thing the sources agree on is the blood. The words are disputed territory. What is not disputed is that a playwright got hold of the story centuries later and did what great playwrights do. He made it sing. He wrote a version of that final moment that was so precisely calibrated, so perfectly weighted between shock and sorrow and the specific kind of pain that comes from betrayal by someone trusted, that it lodged itself in every mind that encountered it and refused to leave. The play was the thing, and the thing became the fact. Not because anyone was deceived exactly, but because the theatrical version was simply more alive than the historical record, more present, more felt, more real in the way that great art can be more real than documentation. And once something that vivid gets attached to a name and a moment, the quieter, murkier, genuinely uncertain historical truth does not stand a chance. What I find remarkable about this is that it is not really anyone's fault. The playwright was doing his job brilliantly. The audiences who received it were not being gullible. But somewhere in the long chain between that stage performance and the modern world, the line between artistic interpretation and historical quotation dissolved completely. And now, billions of people carry what is essentially a piece of dialogue as if it were a fact, witnessed and recorded. The next entry on this list shows that same disillusion happening in a completely different way, through irony so perfect it almost feels engineered. The most famous quote from the man who built his entire career on the idea that nothing means only what it appears to mean has no evidence behind it whatsoever. None. And the quote itself is about things meaning exactly what they appear to mean. If you needed proof that irony has a sense of humor, this is it. Here's what I mean. There's a line that gets attributed to a foundational figure in the study of the human mind, a man whose whole life's work rested on the premise that beneath every surface there is a hidden layer, that symbols carry weight, that the things people say casually are rarely as simple as they sound. His entire professional existence was built on the argument that depth is always present, always operating, always worth excavating. So when a quote appeared suggesting that sometimes things are just what they are, no hidden meaning, no buried significance, just the plain surface with nothing underneath, people found it irresistible. It was the master of overreading, apparently admitting that even he knew when to stop. The problem is, there is no record of him saying it. Not in his published work, not in his correspondence, not in the accounts of colleagues or students who spent years in close proximity to his thinking. The quote exists in that particular floating zone where things feel so true about a person that their actual documented record becomes almost beside the point. And that feeling is exactly the mechanism. People did not spread this quote because they verified it. They spread it because it completed a picture they already had in their minds. It gave the figure a dimension of self-awareness that made him feel more human, more knowing, more in on the joke of his own reputation. It was the quote that everyone wanted him to have said, so culture quietly wrote it for him and left his name on the front door. What makes this one so specifically strange is the loop it creates. A man famous for arguing that things always mean more than they appear to mean gets handed a quote about things meaning exactly what they appear to mean. A quote he never actually said, which means the quote itself means more than it appears to mean because it reveals something about how desperately people wanted a particular version of him to exist. He would have had something to say about that. We just do not know what it was because he never said the thing everyone thinks he said. The irony does not stop there. The quote about not reading too much into things became one of the most widely read into quotes in his entire attributed catalog. People have written essays about what it reveals about his psychology, his philosophy, his relationship with his own method, which is a breathtaking amount of analysis dedicated to something he almost certainly never said. The man who built a career on finding hidden meaning got buried under a mountain of it, generated by a quote that was supposed to be about the absence of hidden meaning. I want you to hold that loop in your mind as we go into the next entry, because the next one operates on a completely different frequency. No irony, no accident, no cultural drift. This one is about an organization that got so good at sounding like its founder that it eventually became indistinguishable from him, even in places where he was simply not present. There is a visionary figure, a creator, someone whose name became synonymous with imagination and the particular kind of stubborn optimism that insists the impossible is just the not yet attempted. He died and left behind an organization that carried his name, his aesthetic, and the entire vocabulary of his public persona. And that organization, staffed by people who had studied him, breathed his brand language daily, and understood better than anyone alive how he sounded and what he valued, began producing content in his voice, not forgeries, not deliberate deception, just the natural output of an institution that had internalized a person so completely that the line between his actual words and their best impression of his actual words became genuinely hard to locate. A quote about the power of dreams and the courage required to chase them got attached to his name in official materials, in themed environments, in the kind of permanent public-facing language that gets carved into walls and printed under photographs. The quote sounds exactly like him. It has his cadence, his optimism, his habit of making large emotional claims with the confidence of someone who has already done the thing they are describing. If you heard it without context, you would not question it for a second. And that is precisely the problem. The organization had learned to replicate the signal so accurately that nobody thought to check whether the original transmission had ever been sent. He had spoken extensively about imagination, about the courage to build things that did not yet exist, about the relationship between a dream and the work required to make it real. All of that is genuinely documented, but the specific sentence people repeat today, the one stamped with his name in official spaces, traces back not to anything he said, but to the institutional voice that grew up around him after he was gone. The brand learned to speak so fluently in his language that it began writing his biography from the inside. And the next entry on this list shows what happens when that same process plays out not inside a company, but inside the entire machinery of how we remember historical giants. A woman wrote one sentence as a summary of someone else's ideas, and that sentence became more famous than anything the person she was summarizing ever actually said. She did not intend to write a classic. She was doing her job. And then her job escaped the building and never came back. Here's the full story. There was a philosopher, a major thinker of the Enlightenment era, someone whose actual documented writing fills volumes and covers everything from religious tolerance to the nature of reason to the mechanics of political power. He had strong, specific, well-argued positions on free expression, on the right of people to voice ideas that others found offensive or dangerous, on the relationship between open debate and the health of a society. Those positions are on record, they are real, they are documented in his actual work. But the sentence that most people associate with his name on this particular subject was not written by him. It was written by a woman who was working on his biography, trying to capture the spirit of his thinking for a general reader. She was doing what good biographers do. She was translating the texture of a complex mind into accessible language. And in doing that translation, she wrote a sentence so clean, so elegantly structured, so perfectly balanced between principle and drama, that it took on a life completely independent of the biography it was born inside. The sentence expressed a willingness to defend someone's right to speak, even while completely disagreeing with what they said. It was the Enlightenment ideal distilled into one breath. And once it was out in the world, it stopped being a summary and started being a quote. Not because anyone lied, not because anyone forged anything, but because the sentence was simply better than most of what surrounded it. And culture has a way of promoting the best-sounding thing to the top of the pile, regardless of where it actually came from. She later clarified, more than once, that the line was her paraphrase and not a direct quotation. Those clarifications are on record too. But a correction, no matter how clearly stated, cannot travel as fast as a perfect sentence. The sentence had already reached places the correction would never find. It had already been printed in books that treated it as a direct quote, repeated in speeches that cited it as historical fact, carved into the kind of cultural bedrock that does not get re-examined without significant effort. What I find genuinely moving about this one, underneath the frustration of the misattribution, is that the woman who actually wrote the sentence got almost nothing from it. The philosopher got the fame. The philosopher got the legacy attached to one of the most elegant defenses of free expression in the English language. And the woman who found those words, who assembled them in that particular order, on that particular morning, got a footnote, if she was lucky. The sentence she wrote described a kind of intellectual generosity, a willingness to extend protection even to ideas you find wrong or distasteful. And then history extended almost none of that generosity back to her. It took what she made and gave the credit elsewhere, which is a pattern that should feel familiar by this point in this list, because we have seen it happen more than once already. Now the next entry bends the whole conversation in a new direction, because up to this point we have mostly been talking about sentences that got transferred from their real source to a more famous face. What we have not talked about yet is the geographic version of that same problem, the way entire cultures and traditions get used as convenient dumping grounds for any quote that sounds old enough, stern enough, and wise enough to need an ancient address. There is a warning about revenge, a line suggesting that seeking it carries a cost that most people do not account for until it is too late. It is a serious, well-constructed thought with genuine moral weight behind it, and it gets shipped almost automatically to ancient Eastern philosophy, specifically to one thinker whose name has become in the Western imagination a kind of catch-all label for anything that sounds like it was chiseled out of something old and important in a place very far away. The problem is that this thinker's actual documented teachings are nothing like a revenge proverb. His work focused on social relationships, on the obligations people have to each other within a functioning community, on the specific behaviors that produce harmony versus the ones that produce disorder. It is precise, practical, and deeply concerned with the texture of daily life. A dramatic warning about the personal consequences of vengeance does not fit neatly into that framework at all. It is a different kind of thinking entirely. But the thinker's name has become so broadly associated with ancient wisdom in general that people stopped asking whether the specific quote actually matches his specific philosophy. The name does a job that the content cannot do on its own. It lends age. It lends gravity. It lends the particular authority that comes from being associated with a tradition that feels distant and therefore somehow more serious than the one you are living inside. What is quietly absurd about this is that the actual origin of the line is murky in ways that make the confident attribution even harder to justify. The trail leads through various later sources, none of them ancient, none of them cleanly connected to the thinker whose name keeps appearing on the quote like a label on a jar whose contents are something else entirely. Someone heard an old-sounding warning, felt the particular pull of wanting it to come from somewhere ancient and authoritative, and made a decision that millions of people have been repeating ever since. And the next entry shows what happens when that same impulse operates not on philosophy, but on the image of a person so severe and so public that her reputation began generating its own material independently. A public image can become so powerful, so total, so completely sealed around a person that it starts producing its own evidence. It starts generating quotes, reactions, attitudes that nobody actually witnessed, because the image itself has become more real than the person inside it. And the entry we are on right now is the clearest example of that process I've found in this entire list. There is a monarch, the figure whose public persona became synonymous with a very specific emotional register. Composed, unyielding, The kind of controlled stillness that radiates not warmth, but authority, the way a stone wall radiates cold on a winter morning. Her public appearances, her official correspondence, her entire visible life communicated one consistent message. Sentiment was private. Dignity was public. And never, under any circumstances, would the two be allowed to occupy the same room at the same time. So when a short, perfectly glacial line expressing royal disapproval began circulating under her name, it felt not just plausible, but almost inevitable. The sentence was exactly what you would expect her to say. 3 words, or something close to it, delivered with the temperature of a marble floor and the finality of a closed door. It matched her documented image so precisely that it seemed to confirm what everyone already knew rather than introducing anything new. But the evidence that she actually said it is thin enough to read through. There are accounts suggesting she may have expressed something similar in a very specific, private context. A single moment among a small group of people, nothing like the sweeping general catchphrase it became. And there are separate accounts, just as credible, of her specifically denying the line when it was presented to her as a thing she had said, which means the most famous expression of her personality may be something she actively rejected while alive and then inherited permanently after her death. What happened here is something I have not seen quite as cleanly in any of the other entries. The other fake quotes on this list were produced by external forces. A biographer invented something. A screenwriter wrote dialogue. A marketing team borrowed a name. But this one seems to have emerged almost organically from the logic of the person's own image. Her reputation was so consistent, so thoroughly established, so widely understood, that the culture around her essentially completed her sentences on her behalf. The quote was not assigned to her from outside. It crystallized out of the atmosphere her public presence had created. And that is a fundamentally different kind of misattribution. It is not theft. It is not invention exactly. It is more like a forecast that got mistaken for a report. Everyone knew the weather that surrounded her, so when someone described a storm, people assumed she must have been the one to say it. The correction never stood a chance, because the quote was not really about what she said. It was about who she was, or rather, who everyone had collectively decided she was. And once a person becomes a type rather than an individual, the type speaks for itself regardless of what the actual person did or did not say out loud. Now I want to take that idea and push it somewhere darker, because the next entry involves a quote that gets attached to a figure who was genuinely responsible for enormous harm. Not a monarch with a stern reputation, not a philosopher with a simplified legacy. Someone whose actual, documented record contains enough real material to fill lifetimes of study and moral reckoning. And yet even this person, even in this case, the quote most commonly associated with one of their coldest observations turns out to be historically shaky. The line is about the difference between one death and 1,000,000 deaths. Specifically, the idea that a single death registers as a human tragedy, while deaths at massive scale become abstract, a number rather than a reality. A statistic that the mind processes without the weight it deserves. It is a genuinely disturbing observation, because it describes something true about how human psychology handles scale. The larger the number, the more the individual disappears inside it. Grief requires a face and a name. Data does not. The line gets attributed to one of the most documented and studied figures in modern history, a man whose actual words were recorded, reported, translated, and analyzed in extraordinary detail over decades, which makes the attribution strange, because despite all that documentation, a clean, verified source for this specific sentence does not exist. Similar ideas appear in the writings of satirists and social commentators, people who were observing the same brutal realities from a safer distance and putting language to something that felt terrifyingly true about how power operates. What I kept thinking about as I traced this one is the emotional logic of the attribution. The line is so cold, so clinical, so stripped of ordinary human feeling, that people feel instinctively that it must have come from someone capable of that coldness in action and not just in theory. Attaching it to a documented figure of brutality makes it feel more comprehensible. It turns a disturbing philosophical observation into a character confession. It makes the horror legible by giving it a specific source and a specific face. But legibility is not the same as accuracy. And sometimes the most emotionally satisfying attribution is the one that asks the fewest questions. The line fits the figure, the way the revenge proverb fit the ancient philosopher, and the way the catchphrase fit the severe monarch. Not because of evidence, because of narrative gravity. Because we are always more comfortable when the darkest sentences have the darkest names attached to them. And what comes next on this list shows that same gravity operating not on a villain, but on heroes, and doing just as much damage. The people we trust most with wisdom are also the people we lie to most comfortably on behalf of. And nowhere is that more visible than in what has happened to the reputations of founding figures, national heroes, and historical statesmen who have been turned slowly and systematically into ventriloquist dummies for whatever the present moment needs to say. This entry covers not one misattribution, but a cluster of them, because once you see the pattern operating across multiple figures from the same tradition, the individual mistakes stop looking like accidents and start looking like a habit. A cultural reflex so deeply embedded that most people performing it do not even know they are doing anything at all. Take a beloved statesman whose documented writing on liberty, governance, and the responsibilities of citizens fills substantial volumes. His actual ideas are specific, complex, and rooted in the political debates of his particular era. He did not write in bumper stickers. He wrote in long, carefully reasoned arguments that require attention and context to fully understand. But a short, punchy line about the best government being the one that governs least got attached to his name and spread through political culture like something people had always known. The real origin traces to a different thinker, a writer of a different era and a different temperament. And even there, the idea was already borrowing from older political language. But the statesman's name was more famous, more resonant, more useful for the argument being made. So he got the quote. Or take a president whose actual speeches and letters are among the most studied in the historical record. A man whose real words are documented with more care and completeness than almost any political figure of his era. A line about the quality of life versus the length of life, phrased in the balanced, solemn cadence that feels entirely appropriate to him, turns out to trace back to a promotional booklet produced by a commercial publisher trying to sell books. The publisher needed authority. The president's name provided it. Nobody asked whether the president had ever actually said anything of the kind, because the sentence sounded so much like him that the question felt almost impolite. Or the founding figure associated with practical wisdom and financial common sense, whose actual writings do contain genuine insight about thrift and the value of money carefully managed. A line about saving being equivalent to earning became so lodged in his name that even the people who know he did not say it exactly still reach for his name when they repeat the idea. His real version was slightly different in wording and considerably sharper in logic. But the polished version won because it was smoother and easier to remember and required less thinking to apply. What ties all of these together is not laziness exactly, though laziness is part of it. It is something more specific. It is the way powerful names function as permission slips. When a sentence arrives under a famous and trusted name, it does not need to prove itself. The name vouches for it. The name says, "This is worth your attention. This has already been approved by someone better equipped than you to evaluate it." And so the critical faculty that would normally examine a new idea gets quietly switched off, replaced by the warm feeling of receiving wisdom from a trusted source. That mechanism is what the entire fate quote machine runs on. Not the specific tricks of any single entry on this list, but the fundamental human tendency to trust the label before tasting the contents. We do it with historical figures, we do it with celebrities, we do it with ancient traditions and founding documents and the words of the dead, who cannot correct us and cannot object and cannot point to the page where they actually wrote something different. And now we have arrived at the end of this list. 33 entries, 33 famous lines, 33 names that carried sentences they never wrote into a future they could not have anticipated. And sitting here at the end of all of it, looking back at everything we have covered, what strikes me most is not the scale of the deception. It is how unnecessary most of it was. The philosopher whose summary became a quote was already interesting enough without the borrowed line. The ancient strategist whose name got attached to a film script wrote real material that is genuinely worth reading. The thinker whose layered worldview got compressed into 11 words had actual ideas that were more demanding and more interesting than the polished version anyone shares today. In almost every case, the real person was already sufficient. The real record was already rich. But culture looked at sufficient and rich and decided it needed something shinier, something more compact, something it could hold in one hand while scrolling with the other. So it manufactured the shine. It built the compact version. It handed it to a famous face and called it history. Here is what I think this whole list is really about, underneath all 33 entries. Every fake quote is a gap between what was and what we wished had been, between the messy, complicated, imperfect record of real human thought and the clean, resonant, perfectly timed sentence we needed someone to have said. The machine does not run on dishonesty. It runs on longing. We long for wisdom that arrives pre-assembled. We long for the right words to have been said at the right moment by the right person. And when reality did not quite provide that, we quietly provided it ourselves and then forgot we had done so. The real question this list leaves me with, and I want to leave it with you too, is this. If you found out right now that the quote you most believe in, the one you have shared the most, the one that has shaped how you think about something important, was never actually said by the person you attributed it to, would that change anything for you? Would the idea feel less true? Would you stop using it? Or would you realize that you never really needed the famous name in the first place, that the idea was carrying its own weight all along, and the name was just a crutch you borrowed without noticing? Think about that. Write your answer in the comments, because I genuinely want to know. And if this list made you look at something differently, if it gave you even one moment of real pause, hit like and subscribe, because there is a lot more of this kind of digging where it came from, and the next one goes even deeper.